Hello all, I'm KelKidman and welcome to Breaking on the Daily, where today we're going to begin with a bit of an older story, one I took a bit to actually get to. And this is a story about South Dakota's governor, Kristi Noem, caving in to the NCAA and not refusing to sign a bill that she was in support of, banning transgender people from participating in sports that are not of their sex. So, what I wanted to talk about with regard to this particular story is not necessarily what she was doing specifically, but rather the NCAA and certain organizations like it, because people will claim that things like the NCAA and other organizations like it, things like Twitter, or I'd say the Federal Reserve falls in this category, and many other organizations like that, are private companies. They can do whatever they want and yada, yada, yada. And this is, well, a communist talking point. I don't want to overstate the case here, of course, but I don't know how else to describe it. These people are generally trying to pose this as trying to defend anything that these, whatever we're going to call them, and we'll get to that later. But they are not, to begin with, private companies, though this won't stop people from claiming that, because you'll see commonly, especially about places that are with regard to social media, that the idea that these places are private companies, they can do whatever they want, and thus we need government regulation to come in and save the day. But I don't think it's accurate to call many of these things private companies, because a place like Twitter and many other big tech websites are getting lots of kickbacks from the government. They are getting many a government subsidy, and the U.S. has actually given $9.3 billion to big tech subsidies in 5 years, and this was a report from back in 2018. By the way, this is a Guardian article, so it's not as though I'm taking this from a right-wing source, but these corporations are getting these sorts of kickbacks, and this is a common statement and a common fact among many things that people will claim are monopolistic corporations. Places like Microsoft, places like, name another one, just all sorts of monopolies. You have the NCAA is actually another good example of such. It's essentially the only organization that does college sports. And I wanted to ask the question, and that is, what are these things? Because they're not private corporations, they aren't controlled by the private sector, and they wouldn't exist without the existence of an onerous state that is regulating to protect them and also giving them money directly. And at the same time, they're not exactly government organizations. They're not something like the CIA or FBI, where they are directly connected to and amenable to everything that has to go along with the government and is directly controlled by many of the restrictions that are put in place through such. But there's some sort of enigma, something in between, and it might be accurate, actually, to call them not private corporations, but rather simply corporations or public corporations. Though I feel as though even that distinction, despite the implications toward a public-controlled and publicly designed apparatus that is simply not directly controlled and owned by the government in de jure, and rather de facto owned by the government and such. But that sort of language has been used a lot of times to claim places like National Socialist Germany are in fact capitalist when they simply aren't. We need a new word for these sorts of things, and this is really important, I think, towards the cause of federalism, the cause of capitalism, and those sorts of things. There is lots of completely ineffective advocacy on the part of people who believe in capitalism because of this misunderstanding in terms of our language, in terms of our terminology, and all that sort of thing. We don't have a very good way of distinguishing between what something like a Twitter and something more like a Gab or a Minds. Because Minds and Gab are not getting the sort of government kickbacks that somewhere like a Twitter is or a Google. They aren't getting those sorts of kickbacks, and they aren't getting regulation being put into place specifically to protect them and no one else, and in fact to hurt their competitors in most cases. That's not what happens in those cases, but there's not a good way to explain this in most right-wing language. I feel as though this needs to be addressed, and if you have any ideas, I suggest you put them down in the comment section. I really do want to see this, and if I see one that I particularly like, then I will end up using it, of course, to refer to these places. I am leaning towards public corporation, non-government public entity, a government-controlled entity. I don't know. Something along those lines. De facto government. I have a lot of ideas swirling around my head, but they aren't completely formed, and I want to crowdsource that information. And so really do comment down below, and I'm going to be checking them out, and I'll respond to whatever I see down there. And it is really important to cover that, because many things have had problems when it comes to how things have been termed. And there's a lot of cases where that is the case. Because there's not just in the terms of capitalism versus socialism, but many of the cultural arguments that we have in all of these sorts of spaces, in political spaces, have this same problem of the right lacking particular terminology to effectively make their points. And another good example of this, I believe, is the George Floyd case. You see, the George Floyd case, the Derek Chauvin trial, more specifically, has begun, and it began on Monday and is still continuing today, where witnesses and all of these sorts of things you would expect from a normal trial are happening. And one somewhat interesting witness that I wanted to talk about was the person who was recording the original video clip that everyone saw. The one who saw the 9 minutes, or 8 minutes or so, of Derek Chauvin having his knee on the neck of George Floyd. And this team said that George Floyd was begging for his life. It said a number of other things that were provocative, and of course, this seemed to be a prosecution. She seemed to be a prosecution witness, at least in my book. So of course, she's going to give a lot of those sorts of answers. And she said, "Oh, I wish I did more and whatnot," though I question certain things. You see, there is a lack of clarity in terms of our terminology in this case as well with regard to conservatives. We don't have a clean and simple way of explaining our point, at least as well as the left does. The left is lockstep in saying, Derek Chauvin, knee on the neck, George Floyd. Every instance you'll see of any talk about this particular case will contain these words, generally all in a row. You're not going to see very much deviation from this, but if you compare it to the right, there's a whole lot more deviance in that respect, a whole lot more variance. Because you see, there is tactics with regard to, well, Derek Chauvin was doing what he was told, to, oh, no, George Floyd was overdosing, and you have this very fractured and not entirely clear strategy coming out of the right with regard to the George Floyd, Derek Chauvin trial. And this is probably going to end up being a problem in the trial itself as well, since from what I've seen of the defense, though I don't think it's incompetent or anything, it does seem to be more fractured than the prosecutors seem to be, at least in my book. I could be wrong. They may end up, working out or whatever, and though, of course, I want justice to be served in the priority. That should, of course, be our first priority in all instances of this case, in any case. But it does seem to me, at least, having seen the full 20 minutes and everything that happened beforehand, and also knowing that George Floyd injecting a whole bunch of drugs and almost killing himself, and is actually not the first time this has happened. It happened before in 2019, and he got lucky then. He almost died. Then come 2020, he does almost the exact same thing, and this time he doesn't get so lucky. I think it's a fairly effective argument, of course. That seems to me the most effective argument for the defense, in fact. Though there may still be problems with certain things that Derek Chauvin did, it makes him less culpable for much of what happened that day, because it makes it clear that he was not the cause of death. It was, in fact, the drug overdose. And that would be a good argument. Of course, there are good arguments. There are good arguments with regard to the tech stuff. There are good small government arguments. You don't need to go the Will Chamberlain route and go and say, well, no, we should just enshrine their monopoly and make sure that they're on our side, which, of course, is a fool's errand, and I think I've made my position clear on that. Back in, I think, January is when I said it originally. But in this case, in the case of Derek Chauvin, it's much more clear, because there's been a lot of work done. There's a whole lot to actually work with, as opposed to social media and sort of corporations, public entities of the sort. There's more terminology there that is easily understood and able to be done. It's just fractured. And that has been a problem in a lot of cases. Though, of course, the right isn't the only problem. People having problems with fracturing and incoherent messaging, because there have been problems on the left with regard to that, mostly in the Harris administration. Because you see, Pete Buttigieg, Buckgig, he was proposing some nonsense. He was proposing a mileage tax. Essentially, if you drive your car, then you get taxed on the mile, which is dumb, especially with the incredibly rising gas prices that have been occurring under the Biden administration up to this point. That just seems to make it much, much worse. And he seems to be moving back on this, of course, because the Harris administration doesn't want to look bad in any case and is utterly obsessed with polling numbers. They backtracked on this because it was really a bad idea to begin with, and I don't know how anyone thought this was a good idea at any point in time. But he does seem to be backing off of this, saying that, oh, no, this whole thing, it's not a part of the conversation. We're not really talking about it. And he's just like, we just want to make that really clear. We're not actually talking about this, despite the fact that I was promoting this just a few days ago. It's not a thing. Don't pay attention. That's sort of what, and that's kind of a common theme among the Harris administration. And for those of you who are, why is he saying Harris administration? Why isn't he saying the Biden administration? Well, I don't know. Maybe it's the fact that President Biden isn't there. He isn't there. But Harris is the person running the administration. Okay, I'm just one step ahead of them, because they're already calling the Harris administration the Biden-Harris administration. They're just one step away. They just have to take away the Biden, and then suddenly they're with me. I'm just being one step ahead. And, a one step ahead is kind of where I want to be. And I think that's actually where I'm going to leave us off. If you enjoyed this video, subscribe down below. Wherever you are, there's many options to subscribe as well, because if you go down even further below where that was, there is the description, where there are many very pretty links for you to click, where you can be sent to all sorts of wonderful websites, such as any website that isn't YouTube, or places where I'll put my thoughts, places like Minds, places like Gab, places like Parler. And I think I have my locals in my channel bio is where I generally have it, though I will be putting it in my description, actually probably today. And, that's all. I'm KelKidman. This has been Breaking on the Daily, and I'm out.